Բարի երեկո, սիրելի հայրենագիտներ, նախքան մեր հայդակին անցնելը պիտի խնդրվի ձեր ցերքի հերացանները անջատել։ Ոգեգոճման միացյալ հանձնախումբի կողմէ բարեկալուս կմաղթեմ ձեր բոլորին հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-րդ տարելիցի ոգեգոճման։ Քիչ յետք ոգեգոճման միացյալ հանձնախումբի կողմէ պիտի խնդրեմ ձեր բոլորին մեկ վայրկյան ոտնգա հարգել մեր հայկական ցեղասպանության եւ բոլոր ցեղասպանություններու անմար հիշադակը։
On behalf of the Armenian Genocide Centenary Committee, I welcome you to the National Commemoration of the Armenian Genocide in Australia. Tonight, we gather to mark the centenary of the commencement of the Armenian Genocide. In a few moments, I will ask that you all rise in a minute's silence. This minute's silence is dedicated memory of the 1.5 million victims of the first genocide of the 20th century. Please rise for a minute's silence.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please be upstanding for the Australian and Armenian national anthems, performed by Isabel Markarian, accompanied by Alex Sahagyan.
Our home is good by sea.
May I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we have gathered this evening and pay my respect to their elders, both past and present. On behalf of the Armenian Genocide Commemorative Committee, I welcome you to the centenary commemoration of the Armenian Genocide. On this most solemn occasion, we are honoured to have among us distinguished members and guests. Father Avedis Hampartsumyan, Armenian Apostolic Church of Holy Resurrection. Father Parser Susanyan, Armenian Catholic Church. Reverend Hagop Sarkisyan, Armenian Evangelical Church. The Honourable Joe Hockey MP, Treasurer of the Commonwealth of Australia and Member for North Sydney. Mr. Geoffrey Robertson QC, leading international jurist and author of An Inconvenient Genocide, Who Now Remembers the Armenians, and keynote speaker of tonight's commemoration. His Excellency Charalampos Stephanos, Ambassador of the Hellenic Republic of Greece. His Excellency Sergei Shipilov, Consul General of the Russian Federation. Mr. Jonathan O'Day, MP, Parliamentary Secretary for Major Events and Tourism, Chair of the Armenian Australia-New South Wales Parliamentary Friendship Group, and Member for Davidson, representing the Honourable Mike Baird, MP, Premier of New South Wales. The Honourable Walt Seckard, MLC, Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Legislative Council, Shadow Minister for Health, Shadow Minister for the North Coast and Deputy Chair of the Armenia Australia New South Wales Parliamentary Friendship Group, representing the Leader of the New South Wales Opposition. The Honourable David Clark, MLC, Parliamentary Secretary for Justice. The Honourable Reverend Fred Nile, MLC, Leader of the New South Wales Christian Democratic Party. The Honourable Marie Fakara. The Honourable Shokat Mosliman, MLC. Professor Gillian Triggs, Chair of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Mr. Tim Wilson, Human Rights Commissioner. Dr. Tim Sepmathanthe, Race Discrimination Commissioner. Mr. Peter Dukas, Chair of the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales. Professor Colin Tatz, AO. Mr. John D., Receipt of the Order of Armenia. Councillors Sarkis Yadelian, OAM, and Artin Ekmekchian from the City of Ryde. Councillors Stuart Kopok, Judith Rutherford, Angelo Rozos, Wendy Norton, Hugh Erickson and John Hooper from the City of Willoughby. Mr. Varujan Iskanderian, representative of Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh in Australia. Most Reverend Terence Brandy, Auxiliary Bishop of Sydney, representing Archbishop of Sydney Anthony Fisher. Ms. Elizabeth Delaney, General Secretary of the National Council of Australian Churches. Lieutenant Colonel Graham Durston, representing the Salvation Army. Your Graces and representatives of other religious denominations. Representatives of Assyrian, Arab, Indian, Ukrainian, Greek, and Cypriot community groups. Representatives of Armenian Community Organization, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We have received a number of apologies for the commemorative event this evening. We would like to acknowledge two of them. The Honourable Gladys Berejiklian, MP, Treasurer and Minister for Industrial Relations, and the recently retired member of the New South Wales Legislative Council, the Honourable Amanda Fazio, who are both in Armenia to take part in the centenary events in Yerevan.
We remember and we demand, on this day, 100 years after the history pages of the 20th century started to be written with the story of one of the greatest crimes against humanity, we gather to remember the memory of the victims of the first genocide of the 20th century. Under the cover of World War I, the Ottoman government enacted a policy of annihilation that saw the wholesale massacres, deportations, and forced marches of its Armenian population, resulting in the deliberate death of 1.5 million innocent men, women, and children. April 24, 1915, is etched as one of the darkest days in history. This was the day the Ottoman authorities arrested some 250 Armenian intellectuals and community leaders in Constantinople. Thereafter, the Ottoman military uprooted Armenians from their homes and forced them to march for hundreds of kilometers, depriving them of food and water to the desert of what is now Syria. Massacres were indiscriminate of age or gender, with rape and other sexual abuse commonplace. Resulting from this policy of extermination were the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians. Assyrians and Greeks also perished in what was the same policy of extermination. Of course, in 1915, the world had not been subjected to the horrors of what was occurring to the Armenian people. There was no single word to describe these unspeakable events. When a word was finally coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish lawyer and survivor of Holocaust, he declared to the world, "I became interested in genocide because it happened so many times. It happened to the Armenians. Then after the Armenians, Hitler took action." Sadly, 100 years on, there are those who continue to deny the historical reality of the Armenian genocide. This wound still remains open, not only for the survivors and the subsequent generations from the Armenian genocide, but the wound remains open for the humanity. It will only be through the international community recognizing the Armenian genocide and the resolve in saying never again that we can eradicate this heinous crime. Tonight we are honored to have with us leading international jurist and human rights lawyer, Mr. Geoffrey Robertson QC. Later this evening, Mr. Robertson will deliver the keynote address on this solemn occasion. I would like to pay tribute to our genocide survivors. Sadly, as we progress well into the 21st century, the number of survivors from the Armenian genocide continues to reduce. We thank all our genocide survivors for their commitment in passing their stories to us, for their passion, for their part in the battle for the recognition of Armenian genocide. We thank those who gave the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that today we can stand proudly as Armenians around the world. Today is a solemn occasion. It is a day of remembrance, a day of sadness, but also a day of triumph. Today we commemorate the genocide of 1915, but we also celebrate our survival. As Armenian Australians, it is our right and responsibility to seek justice, to seek recognition, and to develop the compassionate spirit of Australia in the struggle to end the cycle of genocide. We remember and we demand. Thank you.
Գհիշենք եւ գբահանչենք ահա վասիկ այսօր 100 տարիներ անցած են այդ թվականեն երբ 20-րդ դարու պատմավեպի առաջին էջերը գրավեց արունալի դողերով գրված մարդկության թեմ կորձված ամենահսկա ոճիրներեն մեկուն պատմությունը առաջին աշխարհամարտը բադե արիտ ընձայեց Օսմանյան գայսրության իրականացնելու համար իր անմարտկային եւ հրեշային երազը հայերը փնաչնչելու իր վաղեմի ծրագիրը ծրագիրը ուր չարթերն ու դեղահանությունը բաժար եղան ավելի քան 1.5 միլիոն անմեղներու նահատակության արդի բամուչյան ամենամռայլ թվականներեն մեկն է 1915 ապրիլ 24-ը Ճիշտ այդ օրը Օսմանյան գայսրության ղեկավարները բոլիսի մեջ ցերփակալեցին ավելի քան 250 հայ մտավորականներ, գեղերականներ եւ ասկային կորձիչներ։ Որմե յետք ծրագրված վայրենի աշխատանք տարվեցավ արմադախի լնելու հայ ժողովուրդը իրենց բաբենական հողերեն։ Փռնի քաղաքականության ճանապարհը որուն միջոցով հայ ժողովուրդը հասավ մինչև Սուրյո դեր զորի անաբադները լեցուն են չարթերով, փռնափարություններով եւ այլ ոճրակորձություններով, որոնց գլխավոր թերագադարը եղավ արյունարփու թուրքերը։ Ժողովուրդներ ամբողջովին չարթելու եւ ոչնչացնելու ի նպաստ կորզաթրված այս քաղաքականության արդյունքներ նահատակությունը 1.5 միլիոն հայերու։ Նույն այդ հրեշային քաղաքականության զոհը կացին նաև հույները եւ ասորիները։ Բնականաբար 1915 թվականին աշխարհը անդեղյակ էր անմարտկային ու աներևակայելի արերքներեն, որոնք տեղի կունենային հայ ժողովրդի թեմ թուրք փարփարոսներու ցերամբ։ Եվ վերջապես Պոլանդացի իրավապան եւ ցեղասպանությունը վերաբրող Ռաֆայել Լեմկեն հանդգնորեն գդրեց լրությունը եւ իր ցայնը բարձրացուց աշխարհին հայտարարելով թե ինք հետաքրքրված էր ցեղասպանությամբ եւ գթադաբարդեր զայն որովհետեւ անշատ անգամներ բադահած էր ինչպես նաեւ բադահեցավ հայ ժողովրդին որմե յետ Հիտլեր կորձի անցավ փնաչնչելու հրյա ժողովուրդը Ցավոք սրդի 100 տարիներ անցած են եւ դակավին կան պետություններ, որոնք կմերժեն ճանչնալ եւ ընդունել հայ ժողովրդի ցեղասպանության պատմական անհերքելի իրականությունը։ Այս վերքը պիտի շարունակե արունել ոչ միայն ցեղասպանությունեն ճողորբրած եւ անոր հաջորդող սերունդներուն վրա, այլ նաեւ համայն աշխարհի մարդկության վրա, մինչեւ այնադեն, երբ այլ միջազգային միությունը ճանչնա եւ ընդունի հայ ժողովրդի ցեղասպանությունը եւ մի անգամ ընդմիշտ վերջ տնե աշխարհի մեջ կատարվող բոլոր ցեղասպանություններուն, ըսելով ոչ եւ փնավ գրգին թույլ պիտի չտանք, որ անմարկային ու քազանային այս ոճիրը հետայսու գրկնվի այս աշխարհին երեսին։ Այս գիշեր մենք բադիվն ունենք մեր հետ ունենալու միջազգային ադյանի թադախազ եւ մարդկային իրավունքներու պաշտպանության իրավապան մեծահարգ բարոն Ջեֆրի Ռոբերտսոնը։ Բարոն Ջեֆրի Ռոբերտսոնը քիչ ետք մեզի պիտի փոխանցե հանդիսության գլխավոր պատգամը։ Այսօր հարկանքի եւ երախտագիտության ամենավեհ զգացումներով գուքանք խոնարհելու ցեղասպանությունեն վերաբրող մեր մայրիկներուն եւ հայրիկներուն առաջ, որոնց թիվը դարվե դարի գնվազի։ Անոնց պատկանելության քոյաբայքարին եւ հավատքի շնորհիվ է, որ այսօր մենք հբարդորեն եւ ջագադապած աշխարհին երեսին գքորանք, թե գանք գլինենք ու թեր շադանանք։ Այսօր հիշադակի օր է, այսօր դխուր օր է, բայց նաև հաղթանակի օր է։ Այո, հավաքված ենք ողջելու թուրք-օսմանյան կառավարության կողմէ իրագործված 1915-ի հայ ժողովրդի ցեղասպանության հիշադակը, բայց նաև դոնելու եւ փառավորելու է մեր վերաբրելու կամքը։ Իբր ավստրալահայեր մեր բարդականություն ու բարդավորությունն է արդարություն պահանջել։ Մեր բարդականություն ու բարդավորությունն է համաշխարհային ջանացում պահանջել։ Մեր բարդականություն ու բարդավորությունն է նաև հարադև աշխատանք տանել կանխարգելելու համար այլ ցեղասպանություններ։ Հետևաբար, եկեք սիրելիներ, մեր ցայները միացնենք մեր 1.5 միլիոն նահատակներու արյան գանչին եւ միասնապար գրկնենք, գհիշենք եւ գբահանչենք։ Շնորհակալություն։ Georg Emin was a leading Armenian intellectual and poet who dedicated his writings to the memory of the Armenian genocide. Tonight, Manuk Kotoyan will recite Menk. I welcome him to the stage.
Եվ ինչ ենք մենք ու երկիրը մեր։ Եթե ծուռ նստենք, բայց խոսենք շիտակ։ Եթե նավ, ապա չոր ժայռի վրա։ Եթե գավ, ապա արցունքով լցում։ Եթե հող, ապա քարացած ահից, եթե քար, ապա ճչացող ցավից։ Հզոր մի ոգի, որ չուներ մարմին, եզակի որակ առանց քանակի, քաջարի սպա առանց բանակի, պաշտամունք հնի ու ավերակի։ Եվ ինչ ենք մենք ու երկիրը մեր, թե շիտակ նստած ծուռ խոսենք անգամ։ Զբոսաշրջիկ իր հայրենիքում, հյուր իր սեփական օջախ ու հարկում։ Գետ, որ լոք միապին ենք նայում, լեր, որ հերվից է միայն երևում, անժողովուրդ հող, անհող ժողովուրդ, և ծրված հուլունք, որ չեր ժողովվում։ Մենք խուլ ենք կիսով։ Ամեն մի նոր ձայն թեև շուտ լսում, բայց անկարող ենք ետևից գնալ։ Մեր ականջներում հայոց պատմության քաոսն է խշում, փնտրելով խոսքեր դառնալու հնար։ Մենք կաղ ենք կիսով, քանզի ուր էլ մեր մի ոտքը դնենք, Սուրյավազին, Փարիզի մայթին, Նեղոսի ափին, մեր մյուս ոտքը խրված է Մասիս լերանձունի մեջ, ու մենք չենք քայլում, մենք տեղ չենք հասնում, գծում ենք միայն մեր պանդխսուշան շրջակիցն անել, Մասիսի շուրջն ենք պտտվում անվերջ։ Մենք կույր ենք կիսով, միշտ հաց է եղել մեր աչնարցունքից և աղոտ ենք մենք տեսնում անկատար։ Մի ձերքով ենք մենք կառուցել միայն, ստիպել են զենք բռնել մյուսով, պատերազմ էր մեր հողում անդադար։ Արայի պես ենք մենք սիրահարվում, մեզ թվում է միշտ թե սիրով տարված մեր հողն ենք լքում և վախենում ենք նոր շամիրամից։ Կես ուղեղով ենք աշխարհն ընկալում, մթակնել է կես նանեցկից, ցավից, մենք կես ենք մենք, չլինենք կես հայ կլինենք, և ոչ թուրքահայ, կամ ֆրանսահայ, կամ արաբահայ, կես ենք երկճեղքված, կիսված, երգագատ խորհրդանիշ մեր սուրբ լերան նման, բայց վկա ճեղքված Մասիս լերը մեր, վկա մեր կեսը մորթված տերզորում, և այն կեսը, որ ես եմ, դու և նա, մենք կմիանանք, մենք կամբողջանանք, կգտնենք մի օր լրիվ դառնալու հնարն անհնար։ Մենք փոքր ենք, այո, փոքր, լերների ձերպից սուրացող այն քարի նման, որ դաշտում ընկած ժայռի ուժն ունի փոքր։ Լեռնային մեր գետերի պես, որոնք վիթխարի ուժ են անբարել անծանոթ հովտի ծույլ գետերին։ Մենք փոքր ենք, այո, փոքր, բայց ինչպես գնդակը փողում, ինչպես կաղնուսեն արգավանդ հողում, ոսկու մի հատիկ, որ վերևից է նայում, կապարի ու թուջի քաշին։ Մենք փոքր ենք, այո, սակայն համեմունք ենք մենք, աղն այն մի պտխունց, որ համ է տալիս մի ամբողջ ճաշի, մենք փոքր ենք, այո, ձեզով էր ստիպում մեզ սեղ մեկ այնքան, որ մենք ստիպված ադաման դառնանք, ով էր ասում մեզ ասղերի պես ցիր ու ցան անել, որ միշտ մեզ տեսնեք, ուր էլ որ գնաք, մենք փոքր ենք, այո, սակայն մեր երկրի նման, որի սահմանը բյուրականից միջև լուսին է հասնում և լուսավանից միջև Ուրարտու, փոքր, այն հրաշք Ուրանի նման, որ դար ու դարեր փայլում է, շողում, սակայն չի հատնում։
Please welcome Mr. Toros Boyajan to deliver an address on behalf of the Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration Committee of Australia.
Hokevor hayrer, Dr. Geoffrey Robertson QC, Harkeli Hürer, Kuyrer, Եղբայրներ. Գկտնվինք հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-ամյակի սեմին, ուր անհրաժեշտ է միասնական մոդելություններով ու համատեղ ջանքով թիմակրավել Հայաստանի Հանրապետության, Արցախի, Ջավախքի ու Սփյուռքի արծև ծառացող մարդահրավերները։ Գկտնվինք մեր ուժեր ու կարողականությունը զորաշարժի ենթարկելու ասկային բարդավորության դիմաց, որպեսզի կարողանանք 100-ամյակով սկսվող նոր հանգրվանը դիմակայել նոր ու վերանորոգ գորովով և վճռակամությամբ։ Մենք որպես հավաքականություն հաջողությամբ կրցանք վերականգնել աշխարհին գրեթե անծանոթ մնացած մեր հարցը եւ վերածել բանջարդիրական բայկարի, որուն ընթացքին հաղթահարեցինք բազմաթիվ խոչընդոտներ ու արգելքներ։ Հայ ժողովրդին եւ մարդկության թեմ Թուրքիո կողմէ իրագործված ոճրագործության հետևանքները այսօր կհամենան։ Արդարությունը դակավին չէ հաղթանակած։ 100 տարի շարունակ հայրենազրկված, պատմական հայրենիքի մեջ ցեղասպանության ենթարկված հայությունը հետապնդած է իր արդար թադը։ Բայկարի երկար ճանապարհին մեր ժողովուրդը գրծավ կազմակերպված ուժի վերածվիլ, հավատարիմ մնալով ազգային արժեքներուն, հայրենիքին, իր լեզվին եւ մշակույթին։ Հայկական քաղաքներու մեջ բացված յուրաքանչյուր դպրոց, եկեղեցի, մշակութային կենտրոն հաղթական քայլ եղավ մեր նպատակներուն ուղղությամբ։ Անցնող դասնամյակներուն սպյուրքը գրծավ համախմբվել ցեղասպանության միջազգային ճանաչումին, գորուստներու հատուցումին, հայրենիքի խաղապարին շուրջ եւ հաջողություններ արձանագրեց։ Քաչ կգիտակցենք, որ հզոր հայրենիք ու հանցնարու սպյուրք որպես զիրար ամբողջացնող, զիրար կոդեբնթող օղակներ միասնական ջիքերով պիտի շարունակապար վերահաստատեն աշխարհասպյուր հայության մեկ ժողովուրդ ըլլալու հանգամանքը եւ մեծ ու ամբողջական Հայաստանի գերդումի հավատո հանգանակը։ Մենք համահայկական ավստրալիո գառույցներս համոզված ենք, որ միմիայն համախումբ չանքերով, խոհեմ ու վճռական քայլերով կգարենանք աշխարհի մեջ ձևավորել հայոց ազգային pedagogan շահերը հաշվի առնելու մեր իրավունքները հարգելու գիտակցություն։ Մենք համոզված ենք, որ միմիայն միասնական ջանքերով, ամենօրյա աշխատանքով հնարավոր է լուծել համազգային խնդիրները, ժողովրդահայության իրավունքներու, Արցախի անկախության, ցեղասպանության միջազգային ճանաչման եւ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության հզորացման գենցական հիմնահարցերը։ Մենք կհավատանք, թե հանցագործության անպատիժ մնալն էր, որ հետագային հնարավոր դարձուց նմանատիպ ոճիրներու գրկնությունը։ Մենք վճռական ու վստահ ենք մեր արդար թադը հաղթանակով ավարտելու բայկարին մեջ։ Մենք գիտենք, թե մեզի համար պիտի սկսի նոր հանգրվանումը, որ անկասկած պիտի դառնա ավելի դժվար, քան ինչ որ էր ցարդ։ Պիտի սկսի նոր հանգրվանումը, ուր մեր գործնեության մեջ առաջնային պիտի դառնա ոչ թե այլ պետություններու ճանաչման հետապնդումը, այլ բանջարդիրական այն բայկարը, որ պիտի հիմնվի հատուցման իրավունքներու հետապնդումով։ Այս հանգրվանը պիտի պահանջի ավելի լայն շունչ ու հետևողականություն եւ անկասկած այլազան դժվարությունների հետ պիտի ավարտի մեր հաղթանակով, որովհետեւ արդարացի է մեր թադը եւ միասնական ենք մենք մեր քաղաքական, եկեղեցական, միութենական ու հասարակական բոլոր կառույցներով։ Հայկական իրականության այս կարևոր հանգրվանին մենք կթարաբարդենք այն բոլոր երևույթները, որոնք հայության գամքը գոդորագելու գծարայեն։ Այսօր արդեն բազմաթիվ պետություններ պաշտոնապես ջանցած են հայոց ցեղասպանությունը, այլ ընդրանք չկա։ Հայության բոլոր հատվածներու կորձակցությամբ, մեր անկախ pedagoganության հզորացմամբ մենք պիտի հասնենք աշխարհի ու նույնիսկ Թուրքիո կողմէ մեր արդար թադի ճանաչումին։ Այս է Հայաստանի Հանրապետության եւ հայության լիարժեք անվտանգ ապակայի երաշխիքը։ Գեցե հայ ժողովուրդը գեցե ազատ, անկախ եւ միացյալ Հայաստանը։ Հարգելի ներկաներ, 2013 թվականի մայիս ամսվա ընթացքին ծնունդ առավ Ավստրալիո ապրիլյան եղերնի ոգեգոճման 100-ամյակի միացյալ հանձնախումբը։ Հանձնախումբը կազմված է հայ առաքելական Սուրբ եկեղեցի, հայ կաթողիկե եկեղեցի եւ հայ ավետարանական եկեղեցի, 3 ավանդական կուսակցություններու սոցիալ-դեմոկրատ հնչակյան կուսակցություն, հայ հեղափոխական դաշնակցություն եւ ռամկավար ազատական կուսակցություն, ինչպես նաեւ հայկական բարեգործական ընդհանուր միության եւ համասկային հայ գրթական եւ մշակութային միության։ Անցյալ 2 տարվա ընթացքին հանձնախումբի հովանավորության տակ իրագործվեցան շարք միջոցառումներ, որոնք շարունակվելու են սույն տարվա ընթացքին։ Այժմ պիտի ներկայացնեմ Ավստրալիո ապրիլյան եղերնի ոգեգոճման 100-ամյակի միացյալ հանձնախումբի հովանավորության տակ իրագործվածները։ Հունիս 2013 թվականին հայերը Օսմանյան դարաշրջանին հայր Վարդան Օհանյանի դասախոսությունը, հոկտեմբեր 2013-ին հայոց ցեղասպանությունը եւ նրա հետևանքները հյուր բանախոս պրոֆեսոր Ռիչարդ Հովհաննեսյան, հուլիս 2014-ին Ջուլֆայի գերեզմանատան խաչքարերու գորուստը, որ ներկայացուց Manning Clark House-ի տնօրեն Judith Crispinը, հոկտեմբեր 2014 թվականին հայկական ուղևորություն երաժշտական երեկո ելույթ ունեցավ սոպրանո օրորդ Նատալի Արոյան։ Դարձյալ հոկտեմբեր 2014-ին նկարչական ցուցահանդես տեղի ունեցավ 100-ամյակի նվիրված Նյու Սաութ Ուեյլզի նահանգի խորհրդարանի նախասրահի մեջ։ Իսկ փետրվար 2015 թվականին արյան դվչության արշավը տեղի ունեցավ Blood Drive։ Դարձյալ փետրվարին գեղարվեստական համերգ մասնակցությամբ հանրազանոթ արվեստագետներ Շուշան Պետրոսյանի եւ Գևորգ Հաջյանի։ Մարտ 2015 թվականին բատմամշակութային գեղարվեստական երեկո տեղի ունեցավ մասնակցությամբ քաղաքից մեջ սիրված արվեստագետներու եւ հայկական բարախումբերու։ Դարձյալ մարտ 2015 թվականին հայկական փառատոն տեղի ունեցավ մասնակցությամբ հայրենի արվեստագետներ Զարուհի Բաբայանի եւ Համլետ Քևորքյանի, ինչպես նաեւ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության սպյուրքի նախարար Դիգին Հրանուշ Հակոբյանի։ Ապրիլ 2015-ին նկարչական եւ լուսանկարչական ցուցահանդես տեղի ունեցավ նվիրված հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-րդ ամյակի հիշատակին։ Գրգին ապրիլ խաչքարի բացման արարողություն նվիրված հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-րդ ամյակի հիշատակին եւ հուշ երեկո նվիրված ապրիլ 24-ի նահատակված հայ մտավորականներու։ 3 ապրիլ 23-ին հայոց ցեղասպանության նահատակներու սրբաթասման արարողություն տեղի ունեցավ ուղիղ եթերով հերասպրում Մարաթոր Սուրբ Էջմիածնեն, Սուրբ Հարություն եկեղեցիներս եւ Սուրբ Երրորդություն եկեղեցիներս։ Զանգերու ղողանջ 100 անգամ աշխարհի դարբեր եկեղեցիներու զանգակատուներեն ի հիշատակ 1.5 միլիոն նահատակներու սուրբերուն։ Այսօր տեղի ունեցավ ուրբաթ 24 ապրիլին։ Դարձյալ այսօր ոգեգոճելու նպատակով հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-րդ ամյակը հայ աշակերտներ, որոնք կհաջախեն օդար դպրոցներ, ինչպես նաև անհատներ իրենց գործադեղերեն բացակայեցան, ներկայացնելով հատուկ պատրաստված թրուցիկներ եւ նամակներ սրբազան հոր ստորագրությամբ։ Այսօր նաև փողոքի ցույց տեղի ունեցավ Սիդնեի թրքական տեսփանադան մոտ։ Սույն հուշ երեկոն օրվա հյուր բանախոս ունենալով Dr. Geoffrey Robertson QC հանրազանոթ միջազգային մարդու իրավանց պաշտպան, փաստաբան եւ իրավակել։ Հարգելի ներկաներ, հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-րդ ամյակի նվիրված միջոցառումները կշարունակվին հետևյալ ձևով։ Անզակի եւ 100-ամյակի նվիրված քայլարշավ դեղի ունենա Chatswood Memorial Park-ին մինչև Սուրբ Հարություն եկեղեցի գիրագի 26 ապրիլի առավոտուն։ Հիշադակի արարողություն Ռուկուդի քերեզմանադան մեջ գիրագի 26 ապրիլի գեսորը ետ ժամը 12:30-ին։ Հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-ամյակին նվիրված Սուրբ եւ անմահ բادرակի մատուցում St. Mary's դաջարին մեջ St. Mary's փողոց Սիդնի։ Բادرակիչն է Թեմիս Փարեջան առաջնորդ Քերաշնորհ դեր Հայգազուն եպիսկոպոս Նաջարյան, իսկ քարոզ Սիդնեի կաթոլիկ arczepiskopos բարձրաշնորհ Anthony Fisher։ Դեղի կունենա շաբաթ 2 մայիսին առավոտյան ժամը 11-ին։ Հետևաբար էկումենիկ աղոթք մասնակցությամբ New South Wales նահանգի էկումենիկ խորհրդին եւ մասնակցությամբ New South Wales նահանգի քրիստոնյա համայնքաբեդերու եւ ներկայացուցիչներու միացյալ աղոթք դեղի կունենա St. Stephen's Uniting եկեղեցիներս 197 Macquarie փողոց Սիդնի ճիշտ խորհրդանին թիմացը գիրագի 23 մայիսին գեսորը ետ ժամը 3-ին ցուցահանդես արի երախտագիտություն ավստրալիական կրոնական եւ փարեսիրական գազագերբություններուն որոնք օգնեցին հայ ժողովրդին 1915-ին 1923 թվականներուն կորձակցությամբ New South Wales նահանգի էկումենիկ խորհրդին դեղի կունենա St. Stephen's Uniting եկեղեցվո Ferguson սրահեններս 197 Macquarie փողոց Սիդնի շաբաթ 23 մայիսին ինչպես նաև 5 շաբթի եւ ուրբաթ 21 եւ 22 մայիսին իսկ հունիս ամսվա 2015 թվականի նկարչական ցուցահանդես տեղի ունենա հայրենի արվեստագետներու գործերու հետևաբար հուլիս 2015-ին մշակութային երեկո նվիրված հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-րդ ամյակի հիշատակին Հարգելի ներկաներ, հանուն Ավստրալիո հայոց ցեղասպանության 100-րդ տարելիցի միացյալ հանձնախումբի մեր խորին երախտագիտությունը եւ շնորհակալությունը կհայտնենք ձեր բոլորին ներկա գտնվելու այսօր, ինչպես նաեւ հանձնախումբիս սադարելու անցյալի ու ապագայի միջոցառումներում։ Կհիշեմ եւ կբահանջեմ շնորհակալություն։ Reverend Fathers, Keynote Speaker Mr. Geoffrey Robertson QC, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I also acknowledge the traditional owners and the Gadigal of the Eora Nation as the custodians of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. The Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration Committee Australia was formed in May 2013 to oversee the activities of the Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration. This committee consists of Armenian Apostolic Church, Armenian Catholic Church, Armenian Evangelical Church, Social Democrat Hunchakian Party, Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Armenian Democratic Liberal Party, Armenian General Benevolent Union, and Hamaskayan Armenian Education and Cultural Society. Over the past 2 years, under the auspices of the Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration Committee, many memorial tributes, remembrance services, and functions have taken place and will continue during this centennial year to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, which saw our ancestors among the 1.5 million Armenians brutally murdered by the Ottoman Empire, Turkey still denies. I will now present an overview of the tributes that have already taken place in Australia. In June 2013, a seminar presentation on Armenians in the Ottoman era by Father Vartan Ohanyan. In October 2013, a lecture, The Armenian Genocide and Its Aftermath, by Professor Richard Hovhannisyan. In July 2014, destruction of Armenian khachkars, crossstones, in Julfa Cemetery, presented by Manning Clark House Director Judith Crispin. In October 2014, an Armenian Journey musical tribute performance by soprano Natalie Aroyan. Also October 2014, photographic exhibition dedicated to the centenary of the Armenian Genocide held at the New South Wales State Parliament. In February 2015, there was a blood drive and donation. Also February, Armenian cultural concert with popular performers Shushan Bedrosyan and Kevork Hajian. In March 2015, a historic cultural evening took place dedicated to the Armenian Genocide and the events from 1900 to 2015. Also in March, the Armenian Festival was held at Darling Harbour in the presence of the Honourable Hranush Hagopian, Minister of Diaspora, Republic of Armenia. April 2015, an art exhibition was dedicated to the centenary of the Armenian Genocide. Furthermore, in April, the blessing of the Crossstone and cultural evening dedicated to the massacres of Armenian intellectuals. Yesterday, at the Armenian Apostolic Church of Holy Resurrection, there was a live streaming on big screen of the canonization service of the Armenian Genocide martyrs at the Mother See of Holy Echmiadzin. And today, 100 bell tolls of remembrance as all Australia's churches were invited to join the Armenian Apostolic Churches worldwide to toll church bells 100 times in remembrance of the 100th anniversary to honour the memory of the 1.5 million martyrs. Also today, hundreds of Armenian school students and employees did not attend school or work to pay their respects to victims of the Armenian Genocide. A poster notice was distributed for this purpose, and students delivered a letter to their schools signed by Bishop Najarian, Primate of the Armenian Apostolic Church of Australia and New Zealand, to verify that the 24th of April 2015 is a day of remembrance for the Armenian Australian community. Also today, a Sydney protest took place at the Turkish consulate against 100 years of Turkey's denial of the Armenian Genocide. Whilst tonight we are gathered here at the Sydney Town Hall for the Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration evening featuring keynote speaker Geoffrey Robertson QC. The Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration will continue throughout the rest of this year in the following manner. On Sunday the 26th of April, a march will take place in memory of the Anzacs and centenary of the Armenian Genocide from Chatswood Memorial Park to the Armenian Apostolic Church of Holy Resurrection. This will be followed by a remembrance service at Rookwood Cemetery. A celebration of Holy Mass at St Mary's Cathedral, St Mary's Road, Sydney. The celebrant is His Grace Bishop Haigazun Najarian, Primate of the Diocese of the Armenian Church of Australia and New Zealand. Homily, His Eminence Archbishop Anthony Fisher, Archbishop of Sydney. It will take place on Saturday the 2nd of May at 11 a.m. Ecumenical service and prayers. Diocese of the Armenian Church of Australia and New Zealand in collaboration with the New South Wales Ecumenical Council. The venue is St Stephen's Uniting Church, 197 Macquarie Street, Sydney. It will take place on Saturday the 23rd of May. Followed by a documentary exhibition in recognition and gratitude to Australian religious and charitable organisations which helped the Armenians following the Armenian Genocide in 1915 until 1923. The venue is St Stephen's Uniting Church, 197 Macquarie Street, Sydney, on Thursday, Friday and Saturday, the 21st, 22nd and 23rd of May from 10 a.m. In June 2015, an art exhibition will be dedicated to the centenary of the Armenian Genocide, followed by July 2015, a cultural evening will be dedicated to Armenian tradition and folklore. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration Committee, Australia, I would like to thank you all and express my sincere gratitude for your participation and attendance today, and also for past and future events pertaining to the Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration. I remember and I demand. Thank you.
After the Armenian Genocide, many survivors called Australia home. In the 1980s, an initiative was undertaken by the Armenian National Committee of Australia to record eyewitness testimonies of these survivors to ensure their stories were never forgotten. The Armenian National Committee of Australia partnered with leading film producer Shahan Bekaryan to create a documentary recounting the story of our genocide survivors, who sadly are no longer with us. Tonight, we will present a small part of this documentary. The full version will be released later this year.
Մեր ընտանիքը, հայրս, մայրս, դեռ չհինգ զավակներով միասին քաղաքականության ելած են։
Ասա դեր վնստեցուսին մեզի, ասեմ որ արդյունքում սեզավոր դեր դիտանիք։ Երկանի հայրուր աղջիկ գինիկ չորով չորով շալգած անոթի զարավ երեք հոր կալեցինք։
Что պիտի կալես, եթե չկալես խրվաժի եդևետ կուկա։
Չուրեք մեջ է, դերը գլայք, կերթայինք չուրերն հացկուզենք և են շուները մեր վրա գհարցագեին, հիմա արտուսակ պրադերին մարդ չի ապացում։
5 տարեկան çocuğները bizi daha akçı եղել դղա եղել։ Դաջիկները շաքարով մը կամ թե ոյ ve խապես խուպես խոստաներով մը գարնեի գործունեին։
Ուրֆայի առաջնորդարանն էր։ Հայկական կառավարությունը արեր էր ամփոփ հայ աղջիկները կփռնեին աղդոտ բաներ կնեին բորային կգանչեին։
Facing you today, I have come to say, after so many years, you cannot stay in
nereli toprağın yeresi panelerin hakusun panı tursumun as anak. O çili pani betki kale gorgun panin bura. Nerelin bura. Aynı adın ati amin mar at o çili hivan tuçun yapar. Amin mar.
Hükümet sağ, hükümet bize bakıyor. Hastayın bakar, gözlükten verir, diş yapar. Hastahane beleş. İm uzaymış aynı var. Haradevenk, hayuçunu, Tıbrosner ulenank, mer madgaş bizdikleri, haybet nezan, isk anonkal çanan var, bıçanan var haybetine, ilen zavallar.
Soghomon Soghomonyan, ordained and commonly known as Komitas, was an Armenian priest, musicologist, composer, arranger, singer, and choir master, who is considered the founder of the Armenian musical tradition. During the Armenian Genocide, along with hundreds of other Armenian intellectuals, Komitas was arrested and deported to prison camp in April 1915 by the Ottoman government. He was soon released under unclear circumstances and spent the last years of his life in psychiatric hospitals in Paris. Komitas' most famous compositions include a vast collection of songs which uniquely fuse Armenian folk music with music of the Western classical tradition. The song Garuna depicts the story of a rejected lover who sings of a heartbreak that is as bitter as a snowfall in spring. Robert Andreasyan's arrangement of Garuna for piano will be performed by Alex Sahagyan.
I now welcome to the stage Mr. Jonathan O'Day, MP, to deliver a statement on behalf of the Premier of New South Wales.
Parav Angerne. And to my fellow councillors and parliamentarians, hello friends. Can I bypass acknowledgements of all those very important people here tonight, but I do recognise the breadth and the depth of representation here at this most important event. I also acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands, traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'm privileged to be here tonight representing the New South Wales Government, in particular the Premier Mike Baird. Most of the words that I share with you tonight will reflect Mike Baird's statement, which appears in the program. But I wanted to start and finish with some personal comments. Firstly, in addition to the dignitaries we have here tonight, we have thousands from the Australian Armenian community. Thousands of people who are living and remembering. But we also have filled in this hall the spirits of 1.5 million people, people who no longer live but are remembered. In July 2013, I was privileged to lead a delegation of parliamentarians to Armenia. We visited Yerevan and Nagorno-Karabakh, and the 7 of us who went on that journey are either represented here tonight or currently in Yerevan commemorating 100 years of the Armenian Genocide. So to the ANC of Australia, who organised that in conjunction with the Parliament, I say you've left a lasting impression, and I acknowledge in particular those 7 people in David Clark, Amanda Fazio, Shaket Mosulmain, Marie Fakara, Fred Nile, myself, and Gladys Berejiklian, who only this afternoon asked me especially to convey her wishes of commemoration, as indeed she is doing now in Yerevan on behalf of the New South Wales Government. Can I also acknowledge Walt Secord here tonight, who represents the opposition leader, because the support for the Armenian cause in the New South Wales Parliament has always been universal. Thank you, Walt, and I recognise that that also extends to Christian Democrats, Greens, the parties across the spectrum in New South Wales. And so, in that spirit, I now read some words from the Premier, but words that are reflective of the whole Parliament's sentiment. On behalf of the people of New South Wales and the New South Wales Government, I would like to offer condolences to the Armenian community and pay tribute to the victims as we mark the centenary of the Armenian Genocide. On 17 April 1997, the New South Wales Parliament unanimously recognised and condemned the Armenian Genocide and designated 24 April as an annual day of remembrance in New South Wales. And I note that the Parliament has since reinforced that message a number of times. On this day, we recognise the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek communities that suffered immensely. And I acknowledge that there are diplomatic representation from some of those other communities here tonight as well. 100 years on, 2015 is a significant year for us to mark the suffering of those affected by the Armenian Genocide and to remember the survivors who were displaced from their homeland during World War I. I would also like to acknowledge and pay tribute to the Anzac servicemen who aided the survivors of the genocide and the significant humanitarian relief given by the people of New South Wales to its victims. This genocide commemoration is an important occasion, not only for the Armenian community, but for all of us. And as an aside, I'm proud that Pope Francis, my religious leader, recently described it quite aptly as the century's first genocide. The genocide does remind us of the need to be ever vigilant to ensure that such atrocities are never allowed to happen again. On this solemn occasion, marking the centenary of the Armenian Genocide, let us all remain committed to the goals of peace and tolerance. And finally, again closing with a personal comment, I note the presence in particular of my longtime friend, the Australian Treasurer, Joe Hockey, an outstanding friend of Armenia, and I think he deserves... And Joe, as chair of the New South Wales Parliament's Australian-Armenian Friendship Group, I acknowledge that there are diplomatic sensitivities, but I again call on the federal government to follow the lead of others and acknowledge the historical reality of the Armenian Genocide. And Joe, that message isn't directed to you personally because I know where you stand, but please convey that sentiment to the Prime Minister. Thank you for the opportunity to share this very important occasion with you all.
I now welcome to the stage the Honourable Walt Seckard, MLC, to deliver a statement on behalf of the New South Wales Opposition Leader.
I acknowledge my state, federal and local government colleagues and eminent jurist, Geoffrey Robertson QC. My name is Walt Secord, and I'm here as the state Labour parliamentarian committed to preventing and commemorating genocide. As the son of a full-blooded Mohawk Ojibwe First Nation man from southern Canada, I believe that all genocides require constant remembrance. I believe that it is only by acknowledging what happened that you can prevent acts of genocide happening again in the future. In addition to Anzac Day, the month of April hosts a number of important commemorations for Jewish, Aboriginal, Rwandan, and Armenian communities in our state. For the Jewish community, it is Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Awareness Day. For the African community, it is the Rwandan genocide 20 years ago this week too. Ladies and gentlemen, personally, over the years, I have often reflected on how we provide comfort to those who are grieving. Comforting a mourner is a gesture to both the deceased and the living. This gesture takes on greater significance when a whole community is grieving. Yet I know from my personal experience that beyond showing support, there is little that can be said by those who are not there at the actual events. Ultimately, I've reached the conclusion that all we can simply do is be there with the mourners, and our presence is our statement. That is why I'm here as the Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Legislative Council and Labour's Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Armenia. Ladies and gentlemen, in my own personal capacity in the last 4 years, I have traveled to various sites of oppression and genocide around the world. This includes Auschwitz-Birkenau, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, Yerevan's National Genocide Museum in Armenia, and Halabja in Iraqi Kurdistan. Furthermore, as part of my personal education on Armenia and issues important to the Armenian community, I have visited Armenia twice, visited Nagorno-Karabakh, Javakh in Georgia, and Western Armenia, including the ancient ruins and sites of Kars, Van, Ani, as well as visiting Masis and Pokamasis. My personal background and my visits to these sites lead me to ask two questions. How do these things begin, and how do we as a society prevent genocide from occurring? After all, the perpetrators of such atrocities rely on their deeds being overlooked in time. We know that those who seek to cover up genocide, try to hide or deny such history, only serve to make it possible again. That was Adolf Hitler's very point when he said in August 1939, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Those who commit atrocities today rely on the fact that people forget them tomorrow. That is why we are all here today. They happen because people forget and do not remember. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all here today to honor the memory of those murdered 100 years ago in the 20th century's first genocide. The Armenian genocide began at the same time as our heroic Anzacs started to land at Gallipoli 100 years ago. Let me take this opportunity to say tomorrow, many of us will also gather and commemorate and honor the centenary of the Anzacs. Ladies and gentlemen, April 24th today is the anniversary of when in 1915, Ottoman Turks arrested 250 Armenian intellectuals and community leaders. It was the formal start of the full-scale Armenian genocide. Over the following 4 years, 1.5 million out of a total population of 2.5 million Armenians were systematically murdered. Remembering these events is the reason why we gather today, but we also gather to celebrate and hail the survival of the Armenian people. On a final note, I pledge to continue to explore and learn more about the Armenian genocide, the Armenian community, and Armenia. But I have to admit I have complex views on Turkey. In the West, we have an interest in a stable, democratic Islamic states. But I believe that Turkey has to face and fully acknowledge the Armenian genocide. That said, I am forever an optimist, and I hope that one day there is diplomatic recognition between Turkey and Armenia and self-determination for Nagorno-Karabakh. And more importantly, as US President Abraham Lincoln said in 1861 when he prayed for peace and hoped for the better angels of our nature prevailed in the Union, I too hope that one day Ankara wrestles with its past and fully recognizes the Armenian genocide. Thank you.
I now welcome Mr. Tim Wilson, Australian Human Rights Commissioner.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to make a few brief remarks. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respect to their elders, past and present. As an Australian born with Armenian background, a heritage of which I'm enormously proud of, I share with many people I share with all of you in the room the spirit of solemn remembrance of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. A few years ago, I visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. On arrival, I expected, like many other Holocaust museums, it would provide a narrow narrative surrounding the tragedy inflicted by National Socialism on European Jewry, political prisoners such as the Liberals, Gypsies, homosexuals, and other marginalised groups. If you've been to Yad Vashem, you would know that I was wrong. Instead, the museum provides a human narrative of the long and systemic efforts to demonise those groups that didn't begin just in the 1930s, particularly the Jews. The narrative began well before this time from century-old prejudice. Behind human rights violations are human stories, not just of the victims, but also of the people who rationalised harming others. Early efforts by the National Socialists to impose state-sanctioned discrimination and violence didn't enjoy widespread support. Efforts to silence their bigotry gave it a platform. It took years of state-sanctioned and sponsored indoctrination and demonisation before it enjoyed purchase. It took multiple attempts to create the environment for a population to turn a blind eye to the human face of the final solution. This story parallels the Armenian Genocide. As former US President Ronald Reagan said in 1981, like the genocide of the Armenians before it and the genocide of the Cambodians which followed it, the lessons of the Holocaust must never be forgotten. It wasn't a spontaneous decision that made in isolation that led to the events of 1915 and thereafter. It was an evolution of nationalist sentiment and racial superiority and religious superiority in the second half of the 19th and early 20th century that led to these horrific crimes. The manifestation of the genocide wasn't just the murdering of people, though that is very important to remember. We should never forget the cultural genocide that occurred as well. When you destroy a people's culture by destroying their buildings, their artistic artefacts and their creative works, through their creative and artistic expressions, you're cleansing their past, their present and their future. We cannot change the past, but we do face a choice. We can honour the human stories of the victims of the genocide, their loss, and make sure that it never happens again. We can only do that if we acknowledge the events that led to the genocide and remember the victims' stories to inform future attempts to stand up against horrific injustice. Denying these events is to deny the dignity and humanity of the victims and to undermine civilization's continuing growth by learning from the errors of the past. In the second largest diaspora of Armenians around the world, we also shouldn't forget the bonds formed through this tragedy. The Australian relief effort, particularly that which occurred in Melbourne, was the first major voluntary aid campaign in modern Australian history. This legacy binds the Australian-Armenian relationship as much as the events of Anzac, and our recognition of our shared compassion from tragedy. We knew what occurred. We remember now. Thank you.
The leadership of the Jewish community is unable to be with us tonight, as Friday night is their Jewish Sabbath. We have received the following message, which they have asked me to read. On behalf of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, we extend our thoughts and prayers to our friends in the Armenian community on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. Jews the world over are mandated to regard themselves as if each one personally survived the Holocaust. So it is with the Armenian people. The importance of understanding the Armenian Genocide as a defining moment in history is compounded by the shocking refusal of countries around the world to acknowledge it for what it was. More than that, we need to enshrine in our collective memory the crime against humanity which was inflicted on the Armenian people, so as to ensure that it is understood, learned, and transmitted to future generations. On this important occasion, we are proud to stand alongside the Armenian community in friendship, and will do everything we can to ensure that the memory of those terrible events are never forgotten. Jeremy Spinack, President, and Vic Aladef, CEO, New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies.
I welcome to the stage Opera Australia principal artist, soprano Natalie Aroyan, to perform Grung by Komitas, followed by Pour toi Arménie by Charles Aznavour, together with bass Christopher Nazarian and tenor John Komadina, accompanied by acclaimed pianist Zela Margosyan.
I should like to see any power of the world destroy this race, this small tribe of unimportant people, whose wars have all been fought and lost, whose structures have crumbled, literature is unread, music is unheard, Our prayers are no more answered. Go ahead, destroy Armenia. See if you can do it. Send them into the desert without bread or water. Burn their homes and churches. Then see if they will not laugh, sing, and pray again. For when two of them meet anywhere in the world, see if they will not create a new Armenia.
Please welcome to the stage Mr. Vache Kahramanyan to deliver the advocacy address.
I remember and I demand. 5 simple words that have come to embody the unity of the Armenian nation and the Armenian people who gather on this most solemn day of remembrance, the centenary of the Armenian Genocide. It is always difficult to find the words and the emotive courage to pen such an address. This year made all the more difficult with the gravity of why we have gathered here this evening. As I arrived at Sydney Town Hall earlier today, I took a moment to pause outside the steps of this grand and majestic building and to consider the significance of why we are gathered in this hall tonight. It was in January of 1920 that a few Armenian orphans, the fortunate ones who survived the Armenian Genocide and who were able to find a safe haven here in Australia, stood on the very same steps that we entered from this evening to raise awareness of the plight of those starving, destitute survivors, boys and girls that lay orphaned, forgotten, with little to no hope of salvation. It was in this exact same hall that the premiere screening of Aurora Magardician's Ravished Armenia, also known as The Auction of Souls, a film recounting the horrors of the Armenian Genocide, premiered in Australia, and due to its popularity, was screened for 2 consecutive weeks. It was in this very building that the first meeting of the Armenian Relief Fund of Australia was held to coordinate relief efforts to help starving and destitute survivors of this greatest crime against humanity. 100 years on, we gather in this very same town hall to pay our respects and homage to the 1.5 million victims of this unspeakable horror. I remember and I demand. Ralph Emerson once said, "We are of different opinions at different hours, but we may always be said to be at heart on the side of the truth." Tonight, this commemoration is testament to the words of Emerson that the truth will always be victorious. 2015 has seen an unprecedented level of advocacy here in Australia and around the world. Weeks ago, during a mass dedicated to the centenary of the Armenian Genocide in the Armenian Rite at the Vatican, His Holiness Pope Francis stood with the resolve of a true leader and declared that what happened to the Armenians was, and I quote, "the first genocide of the 20th century." In the past few days, we have seen nations, including Austria, Bolivia, Chile, and the Netherlands, stand up to Turkey's ongoing denial of the Armenian Genocide by taking the moral high ground and formally moving motions recognising the historical reality of what occurred between 1915 to 1923. Hours ago, the German president called for the recognition of the Armenian Genocide, and in a matter of hours from now, the Federal Republic of Germany will affirm the historical reality of the Armenian Genocide by passing a motion in the Bundestag with the full support of the German government. In the past 24 hours, we have seen the President of Israel echo the comments of Pope Francis. We have seen leaders of nations, NGOs, and civil society call on Turkey to end its century of denial and to recognise the Armenian Genocide in order to initiate steps towards justice and reconciliation. Yesterday, we saw the leadership of the Australian Jewish community rise up and add its collective voice to the global recognition efforts, calling on Australia and Israel to recognise the Armenian Genocide. International celebrities, including George Clooney, System of a Down, Cher, Kim Kardashian, and along with sports stars from Andre Agassi to Martina Navratilova, have all joined in the call for recognition to ensure that the memory of 1.5 million victims of the Armenian Genocide is never allowed to be forgotten. The presidents of France, Russia, Uruguay, along with an extensive list of high-level representatives from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Switzerland, Lebanon, only to name a few, have arrived in Armenia to pay their nation's respects to the 1.5 million victims of what is now globally known as the Armenian Genocide. It is not surprising, though, that on this very same day, as the international community marks the centenary of the Armenian Genocide, there is another commemorative event taking place. And no, my dates are not being confused with Anzac Day commemorations that will solemnly take place tomorrow on April 25th. The Victory of Gallipoli, an event that is commemorated on March 18th of each year in Turkey, was conveniently moved to April 24th this year by the Turkish state to coincide with the centenary of the Armenian Genocide, for no other reason to deflect Turkey's ongoing guilt in this unpunished crime. In the coming hours, as world leaders begin the solemn procession to Dzizernagapert, the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan, the representative of one country will be noticeably absent. Weeks ago, we were informed that the Australian Prime Minister had declined the invitation of the President of the Republic of Armenia to attend the centenary commemoration in Yerevan. This was not unexpected, as the Prime Minister had already announced his travel schedule to be in Gallipoli for the centenary of Anzac Day. However, the sequence of conversations that followed thereafter were not only disappointing, but also insulting. The Australian government did not see fit, but more correctly, I assume, was not allowed to send a representative to Armenia under Ankara's ongoing gag orders. It was only last year when, under a Freedom of Information request, we became aware of Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop's letter addressed to her then Turkish counterpart, outlining Australia's strategic interests with Turkey as a reason not to acknowledge the events of 1915 to 1923 as genocide. It is truly saddening that a representative of a country who was one of the first to provide aid to victims and survivors of the genocide, a country that has long championed human rights around the world, will not be in Yerevan as a result of Turkey's ongoing pressure. It is in times like these that world leaders can be reduced to insignificance at their own doing due to their lack of moral courage. However, there have been huge strides made here in Australia on genocide recognition. We all know the steadfast support by the New South Wales and South Australian parliaments. And it was only weeks ago that the Treasurer of Australia, Joe Hockey, joined with many other members of the federal parliament, entering question time wearing the forget-me-not pins that we're all wearing this evening, as a testament to their continued efforts in advocating for genocide recognition. We have seen members of the Australian government break ranks to publicly advocate for the recognition of the Armenian Genocide by the Parliament of Australia. This is no longer the exception, but the norm. And from today, let us collectively work to ensure that the Commonwealth Parliament of Australia adds its voice in the recognition of the Armenian genocide. Since the beginning of 2015, we have seen an unprecedented level of media coverage across all the major Australian print, radio and television outlets on the Armenian genocide, with one notable change: a drop in the use of pretexts and qualifiers to describe what happened in 1915. This in itself has been a huge feat in raising further awareness amongst the wider Australian public. The 20th century has seen some of the darkest chapters etched into the pages of history. 100 years on, 1.5 million innocent victims of this unspeakable crime still do not rest in peace. We still have a long path ahead of us. As the sun rises the day after April 24th, and after the bugles fall silent at Anzac Cove, let us collectively continue our resolve to bring justice and closure to 1.5 million people who were so brutally silenced in an attempt to rid the world of the Armenian people. 76 years after Hitler declared, "Who after all speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians," today I am proud to declare from this stage that I do, we all do. Too often we hear that too long has passed, that after a century, Armenian communities worldwide should forget their demand for justice and that we should reconcile. Forget our grandparents and great-grandparents, their brothers and their sisters. Forget those whom we have known and those who we did not have the opportunity to know. We should forget the evils bestowed upon our people and that we should forgive. Forgive those who do not seek forgiveness. Forgiveness can only begin with recognition and justice. I remember and I demand, lest we forget.
Geoffrey Robertson QC is a leading human rights lawyer and UN war crimes judge. He has been counsel in many notable Old Bailey trials, has defended hundreds of men facing death sentences in the Caribbean, and has won landmark rulings on civil liberty from the highest courts in Britain, Europe, and the Commonwealth. He was involved in cases against General Pinochet and Hastings Banda, and in the training of judges who tried Saddam Hussein. His book, Crimes Against Humanity, has been an inspiration for the global justice movement. And he is the author of an acclaimed memoir, The Justice Game, and the textbook, Media Law. Mr. Robertson is the head of Doughty Street Chambers, a master of the Middle Temple, a recorder and visiting professor at Queen Mary College, University of London. In 2014, Mr. Robertson authored a groundbreaking publication titled An Inconvenient Genocide: Who Now Remembers the Armenians, published by Random House. Its official launch was held at the National Press Club in Canberra. In early 2015, Mr. Robertson, along with Amal Clooney, represented the Republic of Armenia in the Perinchek case. The case revolved around Perinchek, who was convicted in 2007 for denying the Armenian genocide. The European Court of Human Rights overturned that conviction in December on grounds that his right to free speech was violated, and Armenia filed an appeal. Turkey was a co-defendant in the case. Mr. Robertson, arrived to Sydney earlier today after taking part in the global forum No to Genocide, which was held in Yerevan, Armenia. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Geoffrey Robertson QC to the stage to deliver the keynote speech.
The words we've heard tonight that fell from Adolf Hitler on the 22nd of August 1939 was the occasion when he summoned his generals to his villa in Obersalzberg a few days before they were to invade Poland. And the purpose of using those words was to urge them to show no mercy to the Polish people, women, children, civilians, Jews in particular, because they would have impunity. It would never catch up with them, because after all, he reassured them, who now remembers the Armenians? Well, today, the world remembers the Armenians. And there is no doubt, no reasonable doubt to any rational mind that what happened in 1915, if it happened after the Genocide Convention of 1948, would be described as genocide. The only people who have any doubts about that have two things in common. First, they're all paid by the Turkish government. Seriously, they are. And secondly, they don't understand the meaning of genocide. It was indeed from the researchers of some of these genocide deniers that in my book, I argued as a judge, because this isn't a question for historians, it's a question for judges, that there can be no doubt. They say, the Turkish government website says, there were only 1.1 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire at the time, and we only killed 600,000 of them. Seriously, only 600,000 out of 1.1 million. That is genocide, killing a substantial number of a race because of their race is the definition of genocide. Killing part of a race with genocidal intent. Killing, not necessarily, persecuting, raping, forcing to convert, creating, and this was put in the Genocide Convention precisely because of the Armenians, creating conditions in which life is not sustainable. That amounts to genocide. Of course, there were more than 1 million killed. The Armenian church records show that there were well over 2 million Armenians, and we are looking, of course, demography is never clear, but we are looking at the killing of well over 1 million, and we're looking at a genocidal intention that is apparent from sending, well, first of all, of course, able-bodied men were executed. Australian prisoners of war provide some of the evidence. They couldn't believe what was happening. They were being treated fairly enough by the Turks, and yet they were watching while able-bodied Armenians were being executed, shot, and the women and children sent off into the desert, sent on those death marches hundreds of miles through the burning sands to places that we've only heard of today because they're occupied by ISIS. It was clear there is more evidence for the Armenian genocide than there is for the Holocaust, more evidence for the genocidal intent, and the evidence is, of course, in the Ottoman Turks' own laws, the law of deportation that uprooted so many people who were not conceivably a threat to the Turkish state, and the law of abandoned property, that perverted euphemism where people were forced out of their homes at gunpoint, where churches were simply expropriated, often turned into mosques, and the law of abandoned property and the liquidation commissions, which showed the intention of the government that the Armenians would never come back. That is genocide. So there is no doubt, and today the world recognizes it. I've flown from Yerevan. I came in a few hours ago. Plane was delayed at Yerevan because we had to wait for Mr. Putin to land. Now, Mr. Putin's landing is quite a sight because it takes 5 enormous Russian planes to land Mr. Putin, because there's one plane for him, there's one plane for his cars, there's one plane for his security, there's one plane for his doctors. And so it took quite a while. But he was followed by François Hollande, the president of France, the president of other European countries. They're officially in Yerevan today to respect, to remember the genocide. Britain in the middle, the British government is in the middle of a struggle to retain power in an election coming up. Even the British government sent one of its most senior parliamentarians as its official mission as its official representative in Yerevan. Well, Australia will be there? No, it won't. There are a number of Australians. I had dinner with Gladys Berejiklian and the president of Armenia on Wednesday night. They're not in an official capacity. Isn't it ironic that here we are 100 years after Anzac Day, celebrating the courage of our young men in facing Turkish bullets, and we have a government that lacks the courage to stand up to Turkey? But this is an example of realpolitik. And the time will come, I hope it's next year, when the centenary is passed and the Turkish threats to disrupt Gallipoli, if Australia recognised the genocide, will be over. We won't have to bother. If, after all, for all the countries that simply do the honest and decent thing, there is a reality to genocide, not genocide denial, it's genocide equivocation. That was practiced, of course, by Barack Obama when he stood as president in 2008. He said, "I'm a lawyer, I've studied the subject, it was obviously genocide, and when I'm president, I will say so." When he became president, every 24th of April, he said he remembered Medjugorje, the great calamity, which meant nothing to Americans who weren't Armenians. And when taxed about this, he said, "My opinion about the 1915 has not changed." But to discover his opinion that it was genocide, you've got to Google his campaign speech for 2008. In Britain, and Britain and America are the only NATO partners that are frightened of Turkey because they rely upon its bases, they rely upon its surveillance at this stage. Good relations with Turkey are imperative for the survivors, the refugees from Syria, and so forth. Britain, of course, in 1915 took the lead in denouncing the killings. The killings were obvious to everyone in 1915 and should be obvious now. The New York Times was calling it a Holocaust. In June, as early as June, Britain, France, and Russia held a conference at which they denounced it as the first British draft said, let's denounce it as a crime against Christianity. And the Russians said, well, not everyone is Christian. So it was agreed to call it a crime against humanity. And that was the official statement of those three countries in 1915. This was a crime against humanity, and the perpetrators would be punished. That was the promise that was made to the Armenian people in the world as the Armenian people were in the process of attempted extermination. That was a promise that has never been kept. But the importance of keeping Turkey on side has affected Britain in ways that I discovered a few years ago when I made an application under the Freedom of Information Act to find out what was behind Britain's genocide equivocation. And it was fascinating because the British Foreign Office is pretty smart. They said Turkey is neuralgic on this subject. And neuralgic is a good word to describe this obsessive fear of the G word, of being branded, even though it was a different government and a different time, as a genocide. And this memorandum from the Foreign Office to the British government said, our position is unethical in not acknowledging the genocide, but given Turkey's political, commercial, and strategic importance, it is the only feasible option. This is the language of diplomats paltrying with the truth that goes on. You've seen Yes, Minister, and some of you, and you'll know what is being crafted. It has no correlation to truth. It is what powers imagine that they have to do at this point to keep Turkey on side. But it is fascinating that this centenary of the genocide has produced a mass of scholarship, books, articles, documentaries, all of them accepting and underlining and pondering the Armenian genocide. There has been no alternative, no opposition. Turkey is quiet. It can't refute what is obvious to every honest scholar, that what went on in 1915 was genocide. And it began, the trigger for it, the cover for it, was the landing at Gallipoli. And it's an interesting thing. I ask myself, because I had a granduncle who was there in the boats, Bill Robertson, Piper Bill. He played the pipes in the Leichhardt band. And he was one of the first to be killed on landing in Sniper's Alley. And I compare his death and the death of his mates with the deaths of the Armenians. What is the difference? The difference is that Bill, like all other Australians, we didn't have conscription, volunteered to fight for the British Empire. We were British to our bootstraps, as the Prime Minister Andrew Fisher said at the time. So off Bill went, and he was shot by a Turkish rifleman, shot lawfully by those Turkish soldiers in defense of their country. Today, 100 years on, a generalized sadness, I guess, that for 4 years, the political and military leaders of Europe viewed a carnage in which millions of people were killed and could never come to a peace agreement. But other than that, no special mourning. For the Armenian people who, when the Turkish soldiers turned round and turned their guns on them and turned their hatred and vilification on them, the matter is different. We remember in a different way. We have to, because they were victims of a crime, of an international crime that has been unrequited. There has been no retribution. So they deserve not just mourning, they deserve a particular concern and commemoration, not just a remembrance, but a demand. And that is what I think that for all those 1.5 million souls whom you commemorate, their deaths have had a significance, have had a point in this sense that they have inspired a genocide scholarship, a determination to make this crime, when it was defined, a crime that is the worst crime against humanity, that requires the world to step in to stop. And there is another Australian connection that I would make in this regard. The man who, as a result of his study of the Operation Nemesis operation that led to the assassination of Talat Pasha, the Ottoman Hitler, was concerned that a crime as great as the Armenian massacres should rely on vigilante vengeance. Why wasn't there a law, an international law against it? He looked at the British attempts. The British were decent up to a point. They arrested 68 of the leading perpetrators, and they took them to Malta to put them on trial. But as they were all government officials, there was no international law that could punish a government or its officials for killing their own people, for abiding by the law as it was in the Ottoman Empire. So in the end, Britain had to release them, and Germany complicit. And the important thing about the German announcement yesterday was that Germany accepted its complicity, allowed Talat Pasha and the other leaders to escape to Germany, and they were assassinated in the end by the Operation Nemesis. So Lemkin, this extraordinary Polish Jew, realized that there was something. First of all, there had to be a law, because it was outrageous that people of any race could be exterminated by a government, and that government could not be brought to justice. And so he went back to history, and he charted all the ways in which race and religion, these two things that you can't help being born into a race, you usually can't help having being involved in a religion at an early stage, how inflammatory they are, how easy it is for cheap-jack politicians out for nationalist popularity to demean and then to whip up racial hatred. So before the Nazis got onto the Jews, Raphael Lemkin, this Polish genius, had realized the dangers of genocide and the need for a law against it. And he went through, this was 1930. And then, of course, after the Second World War, he had another example to underline the importance of a law against genocide, and he went round the United Nations, all the ambassadors in Geneva and Paris, and he was a hard case, Lemkin. They couldn't bear him in the end because he was obsessive. And the Canadian ambassador said, this guy is the most obsessive lawyer. How can I get rid of him? I know. There's an Australian who's a brilliant lawyer and equally obsessive and equally hard to bear, Dr. Evatt. So he introduced Raphael Lemkin to Dr. H.B. Evatt, great Australian, brilliant High Court judge who had become foreign minister and then the president of the General Assembly. And Evatt and Lemkin got on like a house on fire. They were blood brothers, this genius from Poland and other legal genius from Sydney. And together they worked on the Genocide Convention. And on 9th December 1948, Dr. Evatt introduced into the United Nations the Genocide Convention that is built on the memory of the Armenians as well as the Jews, and which does lay down the rule of international law, that there is an obligation, a basic humanitarian obligation to intervene in situations akin to the Armenian massacres. Well, we've heard a lot tonight about, this is an example, I think, of why it's so important to study the Armenian genocide. We've heard Pope Francis's phrase that it was the first genocide of the 20th century. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Pope is not infallible, and he was wrong about it being the first genocide. The first genocide was in 1905 when the Herero people in Namibia, the Hottentots, were virtually wiped out by the Germans, by the German High Command. Indeed, one of them was Hermann Goering's grandfather. And some of the ideas and some of the people who developed those ideas within the German army were later to serve in Turkey and were to pass on those ideas and those methods of killing, because the Hottentots similarly were sent on death marches and ended up in concentration camps in Namibia to the Ottoman Turks. And again, some of those German officials and their ideas about eliminating races, inferior races, were again taken up by the Nazis. So this is the importance of recognizing the Armenian genocide, because it shows, it illuminates the way in which this inflammatory idea of race hatred can be developed. The Hereros, the Armenians, the Jews. Remember, at the beginning of the Young Turk government in 1909, there was a great hope. They seemed to be liberal progressives. The Dashnaks supported them. Dashnak MPs voted with them. How was it that within 5 years you get the genocide? Well, part was the nationalistic fervor, part was the Turkification campaign, in part the description of Armenians as parasites, as tubercular microbes, this dehumanizing a minority race. Part of it, of course, was the envy. Just as the Jews were envied for their success, so the Armenian minority, with its Christian schools, with its ability and belief in scholarship, they became doctors, lawyers, and so on. They were envied by the Ottoman Turks, and so it was easy to whip up nationalistic support. And of course, when Turkey went to war with Germany, and it was utterly opportunistic, war because they just wanted to get some of Russian land. They reckoned that the Germans would win the war, and so they allied with them. And they used their tame imam in November 1914 to impose a fatwa on Christians, because there's no doubt that a lot of Armenians were killed not only for their race, but they were killed to cries of Allah Akbar. There was religious involvement in it, and the Young Turks got their tame imam to issue a fatwa against Christians. And then suddenly they realized that they were allied with Germany, and so they had to issue an exception, except for German Christians. So there was religious as well that was part of the inflammatory mix. But it is quite clear from the deportation law, it was actually a law, it's there, you can see it written, from the reminiscences of all the diplomats. I mean, the most obvious evidence for the genocidal intent comes from German diplomats who were horrified at what they were hearing, at Talat telling them that he wanted to eliminate the Armenian question by eliminating the Armenians. And they cabled back to Berlin. We can't be supportive of this, and Bethmann Hollweg, the German Chancellor, is on record as saying that it is unheard of in the middle of a war to condemn an ally. So the Germans, who recognized their complicity yesterday, did the right thing yesterday and shamed the Turks who do not recognize their denial, the obvious fact that is in all the diplomatic memoirs from the Americans in particular. And there was what I admire as an inquiry in 1919 by an American general, General Harbord, with 30 experts. They went all over the Ottoman Empire, and they concluded that what the Young Turks had done was a colossal attempt on a race, and that was really the most objective account at the time of what had happened. So there is no question about it. What is so worrying about, and one of the reasons I've been, as an international lawyer, so concerned about Turkish denialism for a while, because although it's faltered and in the face of the truth that has come out at this time, it was based on the idea that they had the right to act against the Armenians because they might have taken heart from the Gallipoli invasion and risen up, because they might have supported the Russians, because they might have been a fifth column. Now, this idea that the Turks have floated to defend their killing of most of the race is iniquitous, because it suggests that you can kill civilians simply because there is a possibility, or because a few of them might, a few of their men might ally with an enemy. This is not on. You can use internment, you can use prosecution, you can use detention. There are various ways in which potential subversives can be dealt with. But what makes the Turkish case pathetic and outrageous is that, of course, there is no law in the world that would permit you to kill women and children by putting them on death marches without food and without medicine. And this is as the courts after the Second World War declared of the death marches that the Japanese inflicted on Australian and American prisoners of war. This is the gravest of crimes. So the Turkish defense, pretending that it wasn't genocide, is itself not just wrong in law, but dangerous in law. The fact that it was promoted by a massive public relations exercise, and it's got to be plainly said that deliberately killing civilians can never be justifiable in order to gain a military advantage. Of course, there were dangers for Turkey on the Russian front. There were some outbreaks of violence from Armenians, particularly in Van, where they managed to wrest the city from the Turks for a couple of months. But if you give any credence at all to the Turkish argument, it would apply to all genocides where there's civil resistance. It would have justified Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka, who killed up to 70,000 civilians in order to eliminate the Tamil Tigers. It could have been used by the Pakistan Army, which committed a horrendous genocide in 1971 against the Hindus and Bengalis. So it's during war, this is the point I make in my book, it's during war that the law of genocide is most necessary to protect minority groups. And it's ironic that the Turkish government has denied genocide of the Armenians on the pretext that they were the enemy within during a war. The very circumstances in which special obligations as a state to protect racial and religious groups are necessary. Now, what we remember, and it's quite clear that what we remember is a crime against humanity, the crime that is now, and since 1948, properly described as genocide. What is it necessary to demand? Well, certainly recognition, and recognition from Turkey, not necessarily because the state is neuralgic about genocide. It's got to recognize that what happened was a crime against humanity, because genocide deniers from Turkey don't even accept the obvious, that it has to be a crime against humanity, and it's a question of whether it's the crime against humanity of persecution or whether it's the most serious crime against humanity, namely of genocide. But Turkey has to go further. It has to restore those churches. There are 2,000 of them that were expropriated. Some of them were turned into mosques. Some of them are still there. There was a church at Lake Van that Turkey a couple of years ago agreed could be restored and then didn't allow it to be used as a church. So it has to be, and there is property, lots of expropriated property of Armenian families, and they have to start launching proceedings in the European courts to recover that. And I think there has to be a symbolic gift from Turkey. It may not be possible to get back the traditional Armenian lands, but there has to be some gift. I've suggested that the Turks should gift to Armenia the magic mountain, the mysterious mountain of Mount Ararat. That it was wonderful the other day in Yerevan, and pretty lousy weather until one morning the clouds lifted and there it was, Mount Ararat. And that would be an appropriate acknowledgement, an appropriate offer of reconciliation. But until something like that happens, then we will continue, although the battle is won. No one seriously, as I say, suggests that it wasn't genocide. But there will have to be that mopping up, there will have to be that form of reparation, because otherwise this is a crime that has gone unrequited. And once that's happened, and perhaps at the same time, in memory of what happened in 1915, you must all be concerned, and you must all, I think of ways of protecting Nagorno-Karabakh. I have been on a number of occasions to this country in the clouds. I've seen its extraordinary churches. I've drunk its hideous mulberry liquor. And I have been on the line of contact and had to drive there because if I went by helicopter, it would be shot down. And this is a potentially devastating conflict for Armenia. It will be devastating, of course, for Azerbaijan. And Turkey's support for Azerbaijan is something that must be broken. That is, I think, the next struggle, and it is a struggle that must be squarely based on the sacrifice of the victims of the 1915 genocide. But genocide, because it's the worst crime against humanity, calls for special study of its causes and for special precautions against its recurrence. There are, as I've said, lessons to be learnt from the way in which a new and seemingly progressive young Turk government decided to solidify its support behind the banner of racial superiority, and how this in turn led its intellectual theorists to demonize and dehumanize minorities from other races. First, they came for the Greeks. Greeks were lucky, they had a land to be deported to. Then they came for the Armenians, and later they came for the Assyrians. Genocide scholarship serves a valuable purpose of identifying patterns that recur in the build-up to behavior in which formerly happy neighbors can be incited to hack each other to death and to renounce the very notion of neighborhood as a living space which human beings of different creeds or colors can amicably occupy. Within living memory, murderous race hatred has been inflicted on the Hindus and Bengalis of Bangladesh, on the Tutsis in Rwanda, the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Tamils of Sri Lanka, the Chechens in Russia, the Mayans in Guatemala, the Chinese in Indonesia, the Darfurians in Sudan, and on other victim groups. Currently, genocide is being committed on the Coptic Christians and the Yazidi Christians by ISIS, and NATO has not yet put a boot on the ground. It surely must. The list is long and it will lengthen, but the world, remembering the Armenians, rejecting the claim that their killing was no more than cruel necessity, will, I think, learn and understand. That is the great thing that is happening by the recognition. There are the genocide deniers tomorrow or today, tonight, will say, oh, will wring their hands and say, it was a terrible tragedy. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a crime. And I want to end by repeating the words that you heard in the film. They're the words of an Armenian writer, William Saroyan. And he said this: I should like to see any power in the world destroy this race, this small tribe of unimportant people whose wars have all been fought and lost, whose structures have all crumbled, literature is unread, music is unheard, and prayers are no more answered. Go ahead, destroy Armenia, see if you can do it. Send them into the desert without food or water. Burn their homes and churches. Then see if they will not laugh and sing and pray again. For when two of them meet anywhere in the world, see if they will not create a new Armenia. I find these words so moving because they touch a core message of today's commemoration, that the human spirit can rise above the greatest catastrophe, the greatest crime, the Medjugorje. So thank you, Armenians, for your laughter, your songs, and your prayers. All your departed souls did not die in vain. Their children and their grandchildren's persistence in remembering and demanding has shown us all that we must maintain the rage against crimes against humanity inflicted on human beings anywhere in the world, and that your spirit, a spirit of humanity, will never be cowed, will never bow down to perverted racist tyranny. So thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we have a special performance dedicated to the centenary of Armenian genocide. Khachatur Avedisyan's Tavir will be performed on traditional Armenian instruments. I welcome Vartui Lepetian on canon, Anna MacDonald on kamancha, Edgar Grigorian on the hall, and Zela Margosyan on piano.
I would now like to welcome to the stage Reverend Fathers from the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Armenian Catholic Church, and the Armenian Evangelical Church, along with the Armenian Apostolic Church Choir, to bring to close tonight's commemoration.
Օրնյալ Տեր մեր Հիսուս Քրիստոս, ամեն։ օրնյալ եղերուկ իշնորհած Սուրբ Հոգույն երթայք խաղության և դեր եղիցին ցեզ ընդամենեսյալըտ ամեն։